Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to bring you the first installment of our healing assignment series. It's going to be covering how you want to properly set up your healing assignments, as well as giving a special bit of insight on how to use your disc ramps to their greatest level of effectiveness. Starting it off with the first three bosses on Heroic, we've got Wrathion to get us going. Big thing on this fight is going to be all about the cadence. At around 15 seconds and 36 seconds, we had our incineration damage that was going out. So, as Disc Priest right off the pole, you're looking to ramp almost immediately in order to meet this damage. What this means from a healing perspective as an officer is that you're going to have to look at how you want to best space out cooldowns for an encounter like this, because you will quickly have 2 or even 3 incinerates going in, as the third one can actually align it with a Gale Blast that comes from the boss. That is a combination that should be having a larger 3-minute cooldown to help mitigate. Something like a Barrier, Devotion Aura, for example, can be particularly useful. And you're generally going to start looking at what kind of composition you have at your disposal. If you have a Rested Druid or a Mistweaver Monk, for example, you might actually want to have those delayed a little bit until there's points where people have to move. If you're quickly having the boss transition from an Incinerate, Gale Blast, and then he starts running away, well, you may not have enough time for your Holy Priest to channel their Divine Hymn, and instead might want to have your Rested Druid pop his Incarn, or have, for example, your Mistweaver Monk pop Revival at that point, so everyone can quickly start running into position to get away from the boss. And again, it's just a cadence. You're going to have those back-to-back Incinerates with about 20 to 30 second interval in between them. For us, it was almost exactly 20-second difference. Every time that we'd have Incinerate damage go out, again, that's when the damage goes out. So for that, I was, as Disc Priest, switching between for example, Raptured, Evangelism, and sometimes I would just have a straight up, a couple Shadowmens into 1 Powered Radiance as my ramp, and I called it good. My advice onto this one is to start cycling those cooldowns as quickly as possible, and kind of, as a raid leader, make sure you have one of them in the bank at all times, because you get in the emergency moment where you have a Gale Blast into an Incinerate, and then you transition, and you quickly need to top everybody while they're moving, get back into position. The intermission phase, where you have to start breaking all those pylons, is an ideal place for your healers to drink and get mana if they need to, but overall, this is a pretty straightforward fight to take on. As we got on into Maut, we have to deal with a Devour Magic mechanic coming from the boss that will be dropping any of those purple circles onto the floor. But you also have to look at the Stygian Annihilation that comes out around 45 seconds and a minute 35 for us throughout our fight. Now, big thing to keep in mind is that as Disc Priest, you can easily use your Radiance charges here and there to be able to deal with a lot of the Devour Magic damage, as it's light enough that it can be justified by using that quick cast out of Radiance, but you don't want to really pop any big cooldown for it. What you want to use your cooldowns is for the Stygian Annihilation. Now, you also have to keep in mind that the Obsidian Shatter phase lasts about a minute for us. We did it in 50 seconds, but this gives you a lot of opportunity on how you want to cycle through your cooldowns as a group. For us, for example, we ended up transitioning at 152 onto the boss. So my advice for this was early on, use your Evangelism at 45 seconds with Mindbender so that everybody runs into the fields, takes damage from running into the fields to avoid the one-shot mechanic that comes from the boss, but your Mindbender is actively healing them in the process by damaging the boss and doing just fine. You step out, you still got some atonements, cast a couple smites, you're able to top them. That also means that you'll be able to have your Evangelism and hopefully your Mindbender at the ready once you start the Obsidian Shatter phase. Raid cooldown wise, you're going to start looking at using some of these low cooldowns early on, making sure you can have a ramp up as Disc Priest with your Mindbender at the very beginning. So for me, Evangelism and Mindbender used at the very beginning of that Obsidian Shatter, and then I have as many atonements as I can put out, plus my Mindbender at the very end of that phase. You'll often see a lot of people holding on to damage, especially if you're having trouble getting out of that phase, which means more damage for you to heal. At this point, we just started putting together a line of raid cooldowns over a 45 to 50 second period to more easily be able to take on that incoming damage. Some of the biggest areas where you're expecting a lot of damage to come is going to be from the beginning and around the tail end. So we, of course, could start using some cooldowns. For example, if we were really being hard affected by it, we kind of overhealed this encounter personally. But if you're really struggling with a lot of the damage, start off with a barrier to help stabilize the group. Everyone gets stacked in together. flat 25% damage reduction. Then you start cycling through a couple different throughput cooldowns to more easily top everybody, and then start to finish with another damage reduction cooldown like Devotion Aura if you have it at your disposal. Other classes like a Paladin, for example, will want to be able to use or want to split up some of their cooldowns like Holy Avenger and Avenging Wrath to be able to have one of those early on, and again space it so that you have another one after that. Make sure large channeled cooldowns like your Tranquility, like your Divine Hymn, or even having Salvation's extra healing being spread out, make sure you're trying to space those out by 10 to 15 seconds each. And with a long phase for his Obsidian Shatter, you have plenty of time to do so to help those channeled cooldowns fill out the middle space for when everyone's taking damage. Otherwise, you rinse and repeat and you go again. Our third boss that we'll be looking at today is going to be Prophet Skitra. This is also a pretty fun encounter because it kind of combines burst damage along with consistent ticking rot damage. So for us, around 23 seconds when we had our first ad detonation, that's when the damage hit. So to counter that as a Disc Priest, I use Rapture very early on to take advantage of it. And in this encounter, because the boss can transition very quickly if you have good DPS, it's actually pretty trapped to be using Evangelism whenever you're on these ads, because then the ad disappears, or you're not able to see the ad, and then you have nothing to hit if the boss goes into his transition phase. Whenever you're entering into that ad transition phase, keep in mind that it starts going about as long as your group takes to communicate, which means that you might have to steadily start drawing upon other cooldowns to work it. What that means for you as a raid leader or as a healing officer is that you should kind of have a bank of cooldowns ready to be able to call upon, or the expectation that who is next on the list to pop a cooldown if we start taking a lot longer than we expect. For me, that meant that I used my Evangelism fairly early on in that intermission phase, before we even knew which ad to really hit, which means I tossed dots up on something and started slamming it to make sure we were able to heal everybody up. Then, once everybody knows where to go, lock gates, any speed totems from shamans can be immensely helpful for getting all your healers into position, as well as your DPS, I guess, to make sure that everybody's able to be in the same spot, to be able to stack up for any healing rains or any ground effects, to make it easier to top everybody off. But it's also important to know that you should not be over-healing these ad phases. The fight can last quite a long time if your group's having a lot of communication problems, and being able to draw upon these other cooldowns is going to be very important for you. One of the biggest emergency phases, for example, is if the ad just spawns as you transition into an ad phase, because that makes it more difficult for your Disc Priest, and it also makes it more difficult for your raid because they might have to move towards the area where that ad is just sitting. Maybe they get to cleave it a little bit more quickly, or it might end up that people are running all over the place, getting out of position, and taking extra damage from that Psyche ad eruption. Important to keep those in mind, but the biggest thing is just a straight cadence. You go into a similar pattern, and once your tanks have an easier time pointing out which one is the right one, these fight gets a lot more rapid. So it makes it much easier to constantly just be cycling through cooldowns. But my advice for this, don't worry too much about the initial ad eruption, as everyone should be further enough away, and make sure you're focusing cooldowns and spreading them out properly whenever you're going into that ad intermission. If you have more channeled cooldowns at your disposal, start looking at using those early on when you enter into the ad phase. Things like Divine Hymn or Tranquility, very important to use early. Whereas if you have a Shaman Totem, you're going to have Incarn from a Druid or Revival, start using those a little bit later into the ad phase as you need them, and make sure you have sort of a priority system as to, if you see damage, this guy's next on deck. Thanks so much for tuning in to our quick look at healing assignments and our ramp assignments for Disc Priests, of course, in the Ny'alotha raid. If you guys, as a healing officer or a Disc Priest, have any sort of questions, comments, concerns about the fight, start letting me know and what you'd like to see for some of these future videos as well, as they can get quite a bit more complicated. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all next time.